the various competing theories on trade, comparative advantage versus import substitution, how to reason properly, why a mistaken conclusion in this field leads to a contradiction in Trump's thinking, and a final conclusion as to what should be the right policy and why. The first thing I like to say is that Donald Trump is, by insulting people, his opponents, by putting them down, by being a narcissistic and braggadocio, is making the issue personal, and that's not conducive to a rational discussion on the merits of trade policy. So the first thing we need to do is get rid of all this personal stuff. Who's smarter, who's richer, it's irrelevant. What we need to do is focus on the merits of each policy. Now, let's examine what he says. So we start with his position. He says that China is committing the greatest theft in American history. They're killing us. Why? Because they're taking all our jobs. Okay? So that's his position, and that's what we have to examine. He's saying that they do this by devaluating their currency. That means that they make their currency weaker and our currency becomes comparatively stronger. That means that with each dollar, you can buy more yuan, and things that are sold in China priced in yuan are going to be cheaper for us because our dollar buys more yuan. And when we go to sell in China, our products are going to be more expensive, so they will be able to buy less of them. Okay? So that's what he's saying. What does this mean? This means that the consumer in the United States, which is something he doesn't say, is getting all these goods from China cheaply, which means they can enjoy a higher standard of living because they can buy more goods and services with the same amount of money. So that's good for every consumer here in the United States. That's something he doesn't mention. On the other hand, the exporters that are trying to sell in China, they're harmed because their prices are higher, and some people that are making some things like computers or television in the United States will decide, well, I prefer to make it in China, and that way I can make it in China cheaply, sell it back here at a lower price, and make a profit and sell more, etc. So when you devaluate your currency, whichever country it is, you're helping the exporters of your country. China is helping the exporters, but it's killing the consumers in China. And the same thing happens in America. The counter reaction to that is, if they devalue their currency, then we will enjoy cheaper goods, which will mean a higher standard of living. We can buy more things with the same amount of money. But our exporters will have a harder time selling over there. So it just is a matter of who you want to prefer, who you want to favor, the exporters or the people that are buying, the consumers of your country. If we devaluate our currency, all that does is do the reverse. It will help our exporters, and it will harm all the consumers in our country. And by the way, that's not a theft. Every country can devalue its currency as much as they want. There's no law against it, and each country controls their currency. So historically, the United States has been willing to accept the strong dollar side of this debate and say, okay, you can devaluate, and our consumers will enjoy it, and our exporters will have a harder time. So that's what he calls a theft. And he says they're killing us because they're taking our jobs. Now, in his view, doing this is really harming America, and the Chinese are cunning. They know they're doing the right thing. They're killing us. They're stealing our money by devaluating their currency. So they're very smart, cunning, and benefiting themselves. Well, when asked why is China having a crisis, he says because they're devaluating their currency, they have funny money, so they're harming themselves when they devaluate their currency. So there's the first indice that there is a contradiction in his thinking by claiming that the same action benefits China and also harms China. He's got to make up his mind. The truth is, as I said before, this devaluation helps your exporters and harms your consumers, and usually countries do one or the other depending on which interest group has more political pull, more power in the country, and is favored at the expense of which other group. Neither are good or bad. It helps one group and harms the other. It's a wash, really. It's not a fundamental in economics. The fundamental in economics is producing, being productive, and trading efficiently. Anyway, let's get to the main question here, which is, why is trade good? Now, in order to understand that, we're going to have to do some reasoning. It's not a personal thing about who's smarter or not. So, but allow me an anecdote which will help introduce this subject. Many years ago, I was in a conference and the lecturer, John Stossel, mentioned at the end of his lecture that he was doing a documentary and that he was trying to prove that trade was good. And he was stumped by this problem. He said that it was clear to everyone why the seller was benefiting in a trade. The seller buys, he wanted to focus on a quarter milk, so the seller buys the milk for $1.50, let's say, and he sells it for $1.75, so he makes a quarter. Everybody understands that. He's profiting from the relationship. He's making a profit. So everybody understands he benefits. But his problem was, how do I show that the consumer, the buyer, is benefiting? Now, after the conference, I came up to him and said, well, I can explain it to you. What you need to do is identify a conceptual common denominator which will show the option of the consumer that this buyer has. He can go to the grocery store, the Korean grocery store in New York City, and buy that quart of milk, or he could produce it himself. And you compare those two options, and you need a conceptual common denominator, which is the amount of hours that you have to work in order to purchase the quart of milk. So he can purchase the quart of milk if he buys it at the grocery store with 5 minutes of work. But if he tries to produce it himself, he's going to have to buy the cow and send it to Central Park to graze and pasteurize the milk, and that's going to take a lot of hours of work. And when he compares those hundreds of hours that would cost him to make the quart of milk himself with the 5 minutes that it cost him to work in his own job that he has now, it's clear to him that it's better to work and produce the money in 5 minutes than to spend all those hours working and producing the thing himself. In other words, letting another person do the job and you benefiting from the efficiency of their doing the job instead of you doing it yourself. Now, the conceptual common denominator is a very important epistemological concept. It explains how human beings can form concepts correctly. They have to identify a unit that converts a qualitative difference to a quantitative difference, meaning at first everything is different, but if you can find a way to compare them, in my example on the trade, the amount of hours you have to work in order to acquire the good, that's a unit that's the same in option A with option B, and you can compare them and see which is better. And so this is what you have to do, and this is what you learned how to do when you were in fourth grade, when you wanted to add two fractions, like 1/3 and 1/4. They're just different. You can't add them. But what do? You identify a common denominator, which is a 12th, and you can relate them. 4/12 compared to 3/12, which is a fourth. You can add them, you can subtract them, because you have a conceptual common denominator. I'm introducing this topic here because I think it's of the most value, more important than even this trade issue. In order to reason properly, you have to identify a conceptual common denominator. That's what I explained to John Stossel. He didn't include that in the documentary, I don't think, but he did include the cow, and he did make the point that the buyer is really benefiting even more than the seller when you see the difference in hours having to work. So the buyer is improving his life tremendously. Now, this doesn't change if you compare buying a product in New York or crossing the state line and buying it in New Jersey. If you're buying a car or whatever, it's the same thing. You can compare how many hours you have to work in order to buy the product in New York compared to how many hours you have to work compared to buying the product in New Jersey. And in this case, it's just price. And you'll see the lower price is better. If you can get the same good with the same quality at a lower price, you're benefiting because you have to spend less of your limited resources on that good. And everybody has limited resources, so everybody is trying to get a deal. That's why we like bargains and we like to save, so we can have a higher standard of living, we can have more goods and services and enjoy a better life. And that's what prosperity is, and that's the right measure of whether a country is prosperous. So the United States is very prosperous because we can enjoy a lot of goods and services with the work that we're doing. And if we produced everything ourselves or everything in New York City and couldn't trade with New Jersey, it would be different. We would have a lower standard of living. We'd have to pay higher prices. And the same thing happens when we are trading with China. It's the same thing. This guy that goes to the store, to Walmart, he is going to buy a TV set there made in China. Now he can afford to buy the TV set. He can work less hours. He'll have time to watch the football game on Sunday. But if he had to buy it from an American producer that produced it 3 times as expensive, he wouldn't be able to buy the TV. He'll have to work more hours until he can save up for the TV, and he might miss the football season. So, if he wants to have a high standard of living, he's got to be smart and save money and buy at the lower prices, which means he's expending less hours to produce the amount necessary to purchase the good. And that's why he benefits from the Chinese devaluation of yuan. They can devaluate all they want. That means that it's a bargain. What they're doing is they're offering all their goods for a cheap price. We buy them and enjoy a better standard of living. And when we do some other job, that if you lose the job you had, you go into another job where you will be able to produce enough to still enjoy this great standard of living you can, because you have all these cheap goods. That's what happens. And in international trade, if one country wants to sell everything cheaper than the other and just collect the dollars like they seem to like to do, well, we have to work a lot less. And they're doing that to some extent right now. But rational, free-floating currencies solve this problem, because when a country their monetary unit, the dollar, is so high, compared to the yuan, and the yuan and these Chinese are accumulating all these dollars. Sooner or later, they're going to want to spend those dollars, and at the rate that they have to make the exchange, nothing in the United States is a good deal. So they're willing to then change the rate so that they can weaken the dollar with the currency exchange, so they can find something in the other country, in the United States in this case, that is cheaper finally, and then they start buying American goods and everything balances out. So you don't really have to worry about a negative trade balance like Milton Friedman explained many years ago. It's actually a negative trade balance is really a positive balance for you, because you're getting the goods, they're getting the dollars. If they want to make pillows out of those dollars, that's their problem. If they don't want to buy our goods, then we never have to work for the dollars that they got. And sooner or later they smarten up and they say, well, wait a second, we want to buy some stuff. So these two views are represented in one that's called import substitution. That's the perspective that Donald Trump is advocating for. Ultimately, import substitution can be taken to the ultimate end, which is, hey, let's not do any trade. Let's just only buy things that we make in the United States. And what is the end result of that? Well, we have a much lower standard of living. Everybody has to work more hours for less goods and less services, so we're much poorer. That's called import substitution. The other theory, which identifies the obvious truth that some countries can produce some things cheaper than other countries, and it's smart to buy from the countries that produce it cheaply because you have to expend less hours worked, which is the conceptual common denominator, to acquire those goods than if you produce them in your own country. And that's called comparative advantage. That recognizes the fact that it's not a smart idea to try to grow bananas in Alaska. It's better to buy them from Nicaragua, and that way do some salmon fishing over there in Alaska, and with that money that you make, buy these bananas at a cheap price. So that's comparative advantage, which has been established for a long time. Another word for import substitution, I think they used to call that mercantilism. And that's when all the countries were trying to get a lot of gold. And they were trying to sell to other people, and they didn't want to buy anything. They just wanted to get the gold. Anyway, it's the same thing centuries later. So what happens when you implement the strategy that Donald Trump is advocating? If they don't do what we want, if they continue to devaluate their currency, we're going to put a tariff on them. And okay, you can do that. That means that the consumers in the United States have to pay a higher price for the goods. And when you do that, if the other country is also thinking the same import substitution mercantilist perspective, they'll say, oh, you put a tariff on us, we'll put a tariff on your goods and make your goods more expensive. So to harm your exporters, you're harming our exporters, we'll harm your exporters. And they do that, and then that's called a trade war. They go back and forth, raising the tariff until no trade is done. So when no trade is done between you and the grocer on the corner, you have to have your own cow to make your own milk. And you have to spend enormous amounts of money producing everything yourself. And the same thing happens in a country to a lesser degree, because we can produce almost everything. It's just that we can produce it more expensive, and we have to work more hours, and we have a lower standard of living. So that's the reason why Trump's view is mistaken, and you should have noticed that right from the beginning. If he's contradicting himself, he's probably mistaken. So I hope this clarifies everything in life for you, including economics, and I hope to expect to get your comments on it. Thanks a lot.